Hi, everybody. Thank you. I'm Shauna Fleischbein with Castle Group Property Management. I am assuming most of you know us by now, but if you're new to us, we do specialize in full-time on-site management of both condos and HOAs. And today, of course, I'm joined with my colleague Laura Bryant and with Keith Skorowitz of Appleton Reese, our expert of the day. So if you want to thank you for joining us today, Keith. And if you want to kind of introduce yourself and the firm, that'd be great.
Sure, thank you. By the way, I'm only the expert just for today. Tomorrow it expires, so we'll have to take care of that. My name is Keith Skorowitz. I'm with the law firm of Appleton Reese. This is the only area of law that our firm handles is condominiums and homeowners associations. We do a bit of real estate transactional work. I'm not here to advertise, but to kind of give you some of our background. This, as you guys know, as board members, or you're at least interested in your association, this is a particularly interesting area of the law right now, particularly here in Florida. Today, hopefully, we can cover some kind of basics, what I think are some really basics and kind of blocking and tackling of some bigger contracts, cable, landscaping, and some newer ones with respect to technology. So I think, Sean, I think at the end, you'll provide my contact information, whatever I can answer in the panel in the questions and the open questions. I'll do my best. If someone wants to reach out to me after, or you can call me, I'm happy to, to do what I can to try to answer the question as best I can. I will say at the outset, I always say this, but all of your associations, condominiums, homeowners associations, they're like snowflakes. If anybody has taken any of my presentations before, I say that all the time. So you'll have a set of governing documents that apply. So we always want to kind of keep that in mind. I'm going to give you some tips on contracts, where to look, where some areas you can negotiate, where are some areas that you can't negotiate, and then kind of we're going to actually start off with something that's pretty interesting as we get rolling. So Sean, I don't know if you want to step in or you want me to just get rolling. It's up to you.
Yeah, no, just a reminder to everybody, those of you again who've joined us before, you probably already know this, but Laura and I will, before the end of the week, we will send out an email to anybody who has registered. So even if somebody wasn't able to attend or you can't stay on for the full hour, no problem. We are going to send everybody who's registered an email. It will have a link to the recording of this presentation. And I think also if you want, Keith, this piece that you're going to talk about here in the beginning, we can also email that out as a little
Sure,
sample for them to
sure.
see. And we'll send you Keith's information there as well as Laura and I's information. So if you have any follow-up questions, we can get those handled for you. And then also, I forgot to ask you this before, Keith, but we can take questions throughout in different
Sure,
sections
sure.
if you
I'll try to
want.
weave it
Okay.
in. Absolutely. I want it to be a little bit of a dialogue as much as I can if it's relevant to that topic. Absolutely.
Perfect. So we'll kind of keep an eye on the questions, Laura and I, as we go through, and we'll feed those to Keith, and then of course we'll have a little open forum time probably at the end as well.
All right.
Floor is yours, Keith. Go
Thank
for
you
it.
very much. So we're going to start out with uh, these cable and telecom contracts. I've seen quite a bit as as costs have increased. As we've all been experiencing inflation. I've had quite a few of my clients come to me and either wanting to redo contracts or at least look at them and their services. So we're going to start out with cable contracts, telecom contracts. And the first step is, as you'll see on the screen there, terminating your existing one. There are a few beware of quotes I'm going to tell you about. One of them is the first right of refusal. There are oftentimes in these cable contracts, your existing carrier or service provider has a right to refuse the next contract if you present them with terms if you've gotten another offer. Now, that as with a consolidation of some of the companies in the industry, that's becoming far more competitive. There is if you may have seen in the paper or in the news in the last couple of months, Spectrum actually sued a large homeowners association that's based in Osceola County over the association's failure to offer the first right of refusal to Spectrum. Often that language is not, it's buried in an addendum to the contract. It's important to know, those of you who are on the board now, boards turn over the board that negotiated the contract 5 or 10 years ago is probably not the same members of the board that are there now. So first step, get with your lawyer, get with your management company, make sure you have the complete document of that applies to all of them, but particularly your larger contracts, cable and landscaping, because they could have been amended over the years. You want to make sure that you'll understand all of your terms. Understand whether or not you have a first right of refusal. If you do, what must you do to comply with that? This is even before you try to go negotiate with a newer company. There's a substantial investment by vendors in getting, whether it's cable or whether it's landscaping and some of the other ones, there's a substantial investment. They make that money, they make their profits typically on the back side of those contracts. So they have to build in sort of a poison pill if you're going to terminate. So be aware of that. In this Spectrum lawsuit, and Shauna, that'd be great if you could send it out, because it's actually a pretty easy read. It's not real legalese. The first couple of pages really lay out what happened. What the plaintiff is alleging in this case is that the association went out, secured a new bid, and realized that after the time had expired that they were supposed to give Spectrum notice and an opportunity to turn down the business under the terms that they were offered. So just be aware of that. It's out there. The cable companies are far more aggressive now. And this is a little bit of a side note. It's very, very important. I'll highlight 3 or 4 things that if you take away, this would be one of them. Oftentimes you'll see in contracts, you'll see these quote unquote confidentiality clauses, okay? The association makes a promise to keep the financial terms of the contract confidential because they don't want other associations to know what they're paying so that that the provider can kind of keep their profits up. There is no such thing as a confidentiality with respect to an HOA or a condo. Those contracts are official record. You need to make sure that you have carve-outs for unit owners to make inspections of those documents. And they can do with them with what they please after they receive them. But owners are allowed to inspect those documents. So be aware of confidentiality clauses. You'll see that if you take a look at this lawsuit, you will see that it's mentioned in there. So, and that's interesting because the association made a promise to Spectrum that they would keep the terms confidential, but the association has a competing obligation to disclose that to owners. So at the front side, that should have been amended when it was executed. Just a negotiating thing to think about. It's out there. I see it a little bit more and more now with companies trying to rein in the data. So I'll keep this moving. And it's 11:10 already. We've got a lot of ground to cover here. You'll see, next slide, please. So you'll see my first bullet point there. It's not really about cable anymore. There's a whole menu of options about what you're going to do, which is related to the second point there. Are you going to add fiber? I'm assuming that some of you are on the call today because you've had an opportunity, or some of the big providers have reached out and said, hey, we'd like to put fiber in your neighborhood. So really, you might want to get a committee that helps a board member to really investigate, what do you have now? What do you need? And where do you want to be? Are your current services not meeting the standard? Is your community growing? Understand what your needs are. And also too, if you are going to do a fiber build out, and that'll be baked into some of the timing clauses in your contracts, be realistic about the timing. There's a substantial amount of technology hardware that has to be added to what are called nodes to bring service to those communities. And that this run to fiber optic has really ramped up post-COVID. So there's a little bit of a break in the supply chain with some of the technology that provides. So they may be ready to go. They may have the trucks out there, they're digging, but they're missing a piece of equipment that they need to provide service. So when if you're negotiating these, you want to talk about, what are they really, do they have an app? Spectrum, I believe, has an app. I think Hotwire is working on an app. Is that important to you? What does that do? Think about connectivity and think about timing. And these are kind of like big picture items. You'll also see if you're on the call and you've been through this or you're going to go through it, one of the documents that they will incentivize you with is what's called a door-free agreement. It is a fancy way of saying we're going to pay you a certain amount of money per door to sign with us. There's a whole, you can Google that and you'll find all kinds of websites on door-free agreements and the association's income. I'm not here to talk about that, but that is certainly something you can negotiate that they will sweeten the pot that can help offset any increases. And we're going to talk about that in a minute in service costs over time. So probably more important than the basic terms is the bulk services addendum. So that is going to contain the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the contract, the speeds of your services, the location of the services, and things you can negotiate on. So let's talk about that. Speeds, upload, download, every community is different. That is an area where if you have to know your worth, write that down, know your worth. Because if you're a community where that a provider is really coming after you, they're constantly calling your manager or contacting board members to have a sit down or a meeting. I have condominium towers, I have large homeowners associations that are able to leverage that. The desire for the providers to be in those neighborhoods is very high. So you can negotiate on these things. Speeds, I've seen it anywhere from 300 to 500, 200. It just depends on what your needs are in going forward. Locations and extra equipment. In buildings and homeowners associations where you've got large common areas, pools, maybe some office space, a gatehouse, typically providers this is an area where you can work with the provider that they will provide those at no extra charge. They'll charge you the door fee for the cost per door month over month, and they will provide hardware and service to those areas. So if you're going through this process in your building or in your HOA, start to identify areas where you wish you had better Wi-Fi or you wish you had a hardwired cable connection. Also, and we'll talk about this later, but I want you to draw a little star if you're taking notes, access control, because if you're working with gates and pool gates and cameras, you're going to need internet access typically in certain areas, and it's going to need to be secure. So as you're going through your internet contracts, identify the areas where you need the internet, and that'll get baked in if they want to. The other thing is look at your channel lineup. They typically will offer a menu of channels. Be sure that you understand what you're getting and not getting, and then also understand what's a la carte. So everybody buys different food at Publix. They cook differently. It's the same way with the way that people ingest their information online. So just be aware of that. Also, too, highlight this area. There are typically hyperlinks to service terms that are in the contracts. And those are what we call dynamic. They change over time, those service terms. Make sure that you understand whether the service terms are fixed when you sign or whether they are dynamic and they can change them unilaterally. I like my clients to make sure that I printed out the terms that apply at the time that we execute so that you know what those obligations are or their obligations in terms of service. A lot of times you'll read that. You've probably seen on social media and the news that when Google or Facebook or somebody updates their service terms, that's what they're talking about. Payments and escalation clauses. This is a key one. You have to understand what are you paying and what is the rate of increase. They will oftentimes use an either or situation I've seen where it's a certain number or some sort of cost of living that's tied to a government number, and it's either the higher of the two. Depending on your negotiating position, I try to do a cap so that you can predict what those escalations will be. They will typically use that escalation over time, so you want to know what that will be. And sometimes they may not take all of it. I don't know. It's up to them. But You also want to make sure that you negotiate. There's typically language in there that requires them to notify you or the association of any increases. You want to make sure that you get that early enough in the year when you're working on budgets. So you don't want a service provider to be on a calendar year that they let you know December 1st of an increase coming January 1st when you passed your budget for the next year back in November. So really need to understand kind of the chronological order of events. And that's very easy, right? You can have them provide that. You can bake that in, mark it on the manager's calendar, and then you can say, hey, we haven't seen your increase. Can you tell us what it is? It helps because, everyone's aware of the increases in insurance now, but we want to know, are there going to be increases in this? And certainly you want to be aware of that. Another thing to think about, I mentioned earlier that boards change over time. And this is often overlooked, is the notice section of your contracts. And this applies to all of them, but particularly with the long-term contracts. Make sure that you have what we call institutional notice takers. So whether it's your management company, your accountant, typically your lawyer, who's your registered agent, make sure that the notice provision provides with a copy to, so you have two addresses, the association and the lawyer or the accountant or someone else. Because if the board moves on or you change management companies, you want to make sure that any notices that you're getting from these providers get to the association. I've seen it time and time again that's not updated. It went to an old manager or it was a board member's address and that person moved on and either a contract was terminated or there was a change in terms and we didn't receive it. So just be aware that you want to make sure that you get with your management company to update those notice provisions. And there's a lot that can link up to that. Next slide. So the easement terms, you will also see as part of that. So we talked about the main agreement, talked about the door fee agreement, we talked about the bulk service addendum. Then there's the easement terms. For those of you on the call who are part of an HOA, you need to be a little bit careful about this is an issue spotting test. There's going to be a test at the end, and it's not going to be multiple choice. It's going to be essay, and you're going to have to do it. Just kidding. But you need to check your declaration for the power to grant easements over lots. Some have them, some don't. There's ways to finesse that language in the easement, but remember, oftentimes, and this is okay, I'm not being pejorative to the providers, but oftentimes they'll use easement terms that are kind of boilerplate to start with. You need to make sure that you tailor the terms to fit your community. What are you trying to do? Do you have that power? Excuse me. And make sure that you've got your property descriptions proper. Check it against the declaration. You want to make sure that you're granting all of those types of excuse me, proper easements. Another important one, and this I have seen is more important in recent years than it has been in the past, as almost every company looks to collect data. There's a cooperation clause typically in all of these contracts, and there's an obligation for the association to provide contact information for each of the owners. And that's fine, because they're providing the service. They're going to get some of that information anyway, and you've signed a bulk deal so that they want to provide that service. But be careful about how expansive that cooperation clause is. Email addresses are not official records of the association. In fact, they're excluded. So you want to make sure that you're not giving out emails to the provider. You just be aware of that cooperation clause and the extent, because they will start that on day one asking for that information. I said earlier, it's not just about cable anymore. It's about onboarding. It's about apps. It's about customer service. I try to get my clients to ask for and to get into the writing some education and assistance of onboarding. If you've been with, Bluestream for 15 years and now you're moving to Spectrum, it's a whole different universe. They have a different model about how they do business, and you want to make sure that your owners are provided with how they get onboarded to use the apps and to use the technology going forward, or else they're just going to be in Shauna's inbox and Laura's inbox asking about where's the start button. So,
hey Keith, I have a question regarding emails. I know you said they exclude even if they opt in.
Well, if they opt in, it's going to depend on the scope of what they opted into. Oftentimes, it's just that they've opted into official notices.
Understood.
So I have some that do opt-in forms that say, you give us permission to share your email.
Right, which is yes.
Okay. Which is more expansive. It's like the scope of an agency relationship. We just want to make sure, again, that we've given that scope, because you don't want to give out that email. And again, it's just one of those terms that's kind of low-hanging fruit that makes your job easier. It's like the confidentiality clause. You don't think about that. You just sign it. You're like, well, wait a minute. We can't keep that confidential. It's just, these are some things that they ask for that the associations need to negotiate on.
Yeah.
Reps and warranties, to survive or not to survive. It seems like a little thing, but there's, in my mind, in my humble opinion, there are some of those reps and warranties that don't need to survive a termination. I'm not going to read all of that slide, but those are promises that the association makes. And typically the list of promises and warranties that the association makes is much bigger than the ones that Spectrum or Hotwire or any of the other providers are making. So I try to balance that out and say, listen, we're going to carve out some of these survivals, and then we're going to make sure that everyone is making promises. If it should be reciprocal, I try to make sure that it is, so that everybody's on alert. So this RFP, to bid or to not to bid, there's really no answer to that. Some people like to have a committee. They're set on a certain provider. Some providers won't go to certain areas. It'll be a geographic thing. So just consider going out to an RFP. If you're in a much larger community or in a large tower where internet and service providers are an issue, you may want to consider bidding, just so that you've got that, you had a menu to choose from in terms of options. When you're doing that process, and even if you don't go out to bid, really consider meeting with before you terminate, consider meeting with your existing provider if you have concerns. It's very difficult, and it's the same with management, it's the same with lawyers, it's the same with accountants. Those of you on the call who are in established communities, there is especially nowadays with increasing in pricing, there's a value built into your vendors that know your declaration. They know the culture of your community. Your management company is your first line, but consider meeting with your existing service provider to address concerns. If they're unwilling or unrelenting and you still want to move on, I have a couple like that I'm working on right now, then that's fine. But at least you can go back to the community and say, hey, we tried, but now we're going to have to go in a different direction. Termination clause and outstanding balances, just make sure you are understanding kind of what are there. If you can terminate, there may be, like I mentioned earlier, some poison pills. And we're kind of switching over now. There's a little bit here of overlap in terms of the landscaping contracts. I'm just going to kind of switch gears real quick. And I bring this up. I wasn't going to do this, but I've had too many examples in the last couple of months where I thought it would be helpful to you. So I apologize if it's not. But in this time of inflation, my boards are looking to cut costs. They're often looking to cut costs. And that's understandable. But beware of cutting too deep. So say, Keith, that's great, but it's still very expensive. What can we do? Well, I would say to you, particularly with landscape contracts, everybody, there's a whole host of things that fall under your landscape contract. The first is to understand what services are you getting. I had a client the other day that has a landscape contract. They also have a tree trimming contract, and they have a mulch contract. Well, it turns out that their landscape contract actually included all the tree trimming that they needed. So they didn't, and that's not anybody's fault. It's just a function of boards change over time. You've got to have, this is where management really comes in, is having some contract management practices where you understand who do you contact, what services are being provided, and who's checking on them, and when can we terminate. Again, this is an opportunity where you may be able to cut costs, or on the other side, maybe you have overlap, or maybe there are services that were promised, because people from your vendor companies move on too. Maybe you have services that were promised that you're not getting. Maybe it's being overlooked. Maybe mulch was baked into that price. I don't know. So these are some things you want to look at in terms of your landscaping contract. And more so with landscaping than in other contracts is you want to make sure you've got a complaint process. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. Irrigation is another area where a lot of times, Laura and Sean, I'm sure you see this, they have separate irrigation contracts, and they may or may not be needed. I don't know. It depends on the age of the system, depends on who knows, depends on what's baked into your current landscape, quote unquote, contract. Another area to look for overlap. So you want to make sure that you take a look at that. The other way you can build in efficiencies is having a complaint process. For those of you who are in much, much larger communities, I have some communities that are, greater than 5,000 in that range of homes. There's a substantial amount of common area. It's virtually impossible to audit all of that work on the management side. It's beyond the scope of doing that, but you still get owner complaints about grass or tree trimming or hedge trimming. So there are service providers out there that can help you audit that. Maybe once a quarter, they look at what's been done versus the terms that can help you, again, manage that contract, that can bring in efficiencies to hold the vendor accountable to what they promised to do. Also, too, in terms of your material terms, make sure you understand who the point of contact is. Sometimes there's a lot of chiefs and not enough Indians. So I don't mean to be pejorative. I'm using that colloquially. That there's too many people talking to the. You guys are laughing because it's true. What happens is that there's 4 board members and 3 committee members talking to the landscape company, and everybody's either looking out for their neighbor or somebody else. So I encourage my clients to have one point of contact. If it's not a board member, that's okay. And just make sure you delegate that authority and have them report back. The contract management is active and it takes time. So definitely want to keep that going forward. Next slide. So this is, we'll talk a little bit here about access control. So you'll hear this often. I'm going to answer that. That's a great question, Patricia. I'm going to answer that in 1 second. Those of you who are in gated communities or in condominiums with access control, it is not security. So you'll hear that term being bandied about. It's not security. What you're actually doing is controlling access points about who is allowed in, who is allowed out, who's a guest, and what is your process for that. First thing you need to do is you need to make sure you have a policy on your data. Get with your lawyer, understand where your data is. If it's not written, it is not an official record, but you need to have a policy on who can have access to that data, or people will start asking for that video from the 13th at the pool. So you need to be aware of that. And you need to make sure that you have a policy that says you're providing access and monitoring, but it may not be full-time monitoring, because you can set yourself up for claims if someone drowns, or if there's an assault in a common area, you can set yourself up for a claim in that direction. So it's really important that you get with your lawyer and understand the scope of what you're trying to do. Those of you who I've seen a lot of this recently, and this applies to really any of your contracts where you are receiving any equipment whatsoever. A lot of that equipment comes in from third-party providers, and there's no promise on the warranties of that equipment. Typically, what they will do is in the access control, they'll say, we're putting in 2 framulators, 14 cameras, and a swipe and a video machine, but those are manufactured by X. We will provide you those warranties. You want to make sure that you get, this is often overlooked, you want to make sure you get those warranties in case something goes wrong. So you can say, hey, wait a minute, that broke. we're not paying for that. There was a manufacturer warranty on that. And oftentimes when you're going through the negotiation process, that's the point in time at which you can negotiate an extended warranty or say, we're not, a lot of times there's short windows like 60 days or 90 days. Well, that doesn't get us through one rainy season. So I try to tell my clients to negotiate on making the service provider say, hey, no matter what, outside of intentional damage or someone runs it over, we would like to have that warranted, for at least 6 to 8 months or maybe even a year after it's been built. And then also too, what are the best practices on maintaining it? Who's responsible for maintaining that equipment? That can vary from provider to provider. Are there things that the association should be doing? Does someone come out from there and check it? A lot of times these things are checked remotely. So you want to ask for those records to say, okay, you checked them remotely. Well, does it need work? There's something wrong. Because the last thing you need is Thanksgiving Day or Christmas Eve or New Year's Day, and you're scared and your access control goes down, because that's not going to be fun for anybody.
Those are the only times that emergencies happen,
right?
After hours,
right. That's right.
Weekends, holidays. Yeah.
Right. Patricia asked, for those of you who can't see, excuse me, is it up to our management company to be responsible to know our contracts with our landscaper? It is. It is a dual responsibility. It is the ultimate obligation of the board to understand the terms of the contracts that they sign, but you should work with management to have a folder or a digital folder of that contract and the material terms and the scope. What are they doing and when? Is it simply a mow, blow, and go, or is it trimming? Is it hedge work? Is it sweeping? Is it pressure washing? What's included and when? But yes, the management company should know that and should be staying on top of it. But ultimately, it's the board's responsibility to know. But good managers will be way ahead of you and say, hey, mulch is coming next month, or hey, pressure washing is coming next month. We've got to get some signage up. Patricia, I hope that answers that, but it's a dual, but yes to the management company. Let's see, Robert just asked, is it possible to have seasonal considerations built into a contract? About 80 of our park is seasonal, 3 to 4 months on site. It depends, Robert. If you're talking about cable, that might be a situation where bulk isn't a good fit for your community because it is typically a flat line payment. You can certainly ask, but I don't know, because of the way that they build in their margins for profit. And that's another thing to consider. That's a great question, Robert, because some communities there are some downsides to having the bulk, right? It's a one size fits all. It might not be something for your community. So that would be something that you'd have to get with your current provider or get with your board. And this also might be an opportunity to get with, there are telecom cable advisors. And we talk about this, and Laura and I talked about this and Shauna the other day. There's a range of quality, as there is with everything, in those types of providers. So that might be good. That might be a good situation, Robert, where you are asking maybe get a consultant to tell you what's available. Maybe you need a smaller provider. Maybe you can do that, because you certainly don't want to pay for cable through May, June, July, and August if you're not there. So, wow, we went through that pretty quickly.
I know. That's what I was just thinking.
Does anybody else have any questions? I could talk about this all day. We could talk about all kinds of contracts. It doesn't have to be contracts, folks. If you have other questions about your operations, I'm happy to help. But
that got an open forum now.
So let's just summarize real quick, right? So you want to know, with all of your contracts, particularly ones we talked about today, is you want to know first, what is the association actually receiving? What services are they receiving? And be precise about it. And with respect to those services, when are you getting those services? And who's watching? Robert, 100%.
I was just going to say that. I was going to say that on your behalf, Keith, so it didn't sound like you were, trying to push the attorney, like looking, but 100% from management side, we want every contract blessed by your attorney. Like, I don't care, every single one. And they should not be signed by a property manager. They should be signed by a board member.
So that's a good point, Shauna. That's a really good point.
At least that's our policy. That's our
Let me
policy.
talk about some best practices which relate to contracts, particularly these large ones. And I'm going to reiterate that point. Under no circumstances should a manager sign a contract on behalf of an association. Always make sure that you have a meeting scheduled to vote up or down on the approval of that contract. Typically on your larger ones, I like to see a meeting or two about the details and have the board discuss it so that there's no question that this multi-million-dollar cable deal or this multi-million-dollar landscape deal is sprung on the board and the owners, depending on the culture in your community. If you have a large participating group of owners, set a meeting and talk about the details of the contract. Choreograph it with your manager, understand the terms, and everybody is busy. So I understand that what I'm asking sometimes is best, and you may not be able to do it, but I certainly strongly encourage my clients to have a couple of meetings and to vote on it. Patricia just asked, is a signed estimate as good or the same as a contract? The answer is, Patricia, it depends. Typically, an estimate is for repair. You're not going to get that. So with respect to larger contracts, let's put roofing aside, because a lot of times you'll get an estimate on a roof, and I'll explain why that's a little bit different. But with cable, with landscaping, access control, those are kind of the big ones I can think off the top of my head. There's a lot of boilerplate language that those folks like to deal with. So you're going to get an offer that has a lot of the terms that you need baked in. So if you're getting an estimate on a roof repair and they say, we think it's going to cost $10,000 a building to do X, but there's typically language in those estimates, Patricia, that says it depends on what we find after the fact, because they don't know what's underneath that underlayment layer. They don't know if the soffits are damaged. So just keep that in mind. Typically the answer is no. If you have a question, contact your lawyer. Don't feel forced. Let me say this. Don't feel forced to sign a contract if you're uncomfortable and you haven't spoken to your manager or your lawyer. Everything's negotiable. Unless it's an emergency, don't feel forced, Patricia, that you have to do that. Steve Shaw asked, can you demand a service level agreement response time for outages? Yes. And Steve, that's actually that's a great question. It's typically included. And there's different levels of service for different types of outages. And then it's very favorable to the service provider, but they are there. You should take a look at your service level agreement. It's probably 99 times out of 100, Steve, it's a hyperlink that's baked into one of your contracts. But yes, you can, but it's typically already there. Painting too. So painting estimates, Patricia, I like to get, Patricia, I'm assuming that's related to your last question about estimates. Painting estimates, it depends on the size of the contract. If you're just fixing an area, let your management company handle that. If it's a couple of $1,000s, you have to get a repair done. If you're repainting buildings, that's a completely different set of circumstances. I want timelines. I want paint warranties. I want to understand who's warranting the work, both the service and the paint. I want to know who's going to get done. You want payment schedules. You want lien release language in case they use subcontractors. That's a completely different set of circumstances. But with contractors like that, with the painting, particularly roofing, you want to make sure you have some of that language that has to do with lien release and payment terms. That's absolutely critical. Great question. Can you explain more about access control and how it relates to security? So a homeowners association that's gated simply means that only typically you own your roads, or it's a condominium tower, or it's a private condominium complex. The association is responsible for providing ingress and egress to the members, the unit owners, their guests, and invitees. You are not providing security. Should someone thwart the access control and hop over a fence and commit a felony or a misdemeanor or steal something, it is not the obligation of the association to provide security. You are simply taking reasonable steps to control access and to make it easy for people to get in and out. So the association is not a security provider. That's the best way I know how to say it. It's about letting people in and out.
Mhm.
I can. Scott Schmidt asked, our current provider states that you can buy 1 gig up and down for an additional price. All speed tests show they only provide 300 megs up and down. We asked them for credit. Their tech has confirmed their speed. So you may have, depending, Scott, on the terms of your contract, you certainly would want to get with A, your lawyer, and B, with your tech and present this, because you may have a breach. And if people are paying, and again, that might be an a la carte issue, if they're providing 1 gig up and down, if you're paying for that and it's not being provided, you have a potential for breach there. But I'd have to look at the terms of the contract and to see. And you'd also have to look at the fine print and how often is it happening. So a lot of times it'll be based on they couldn't do it at that time. I don't know. I'd have to look at the particular facts.
And I think, Keith, you had talked earlier about how the importance of kind of understanding what you have and how it works. I know that I chatted with a association, not a Castle client, earlier this year, who was changing their access control over to electronic, like virtual. And after everything was installed and they'd gone through everything, they realized that the internet that they have there is not going to support it. Like the whole thing is pretty much a wash now because it can't support like the needs and
right.
That's the cart before the horse, right?
Right. So we talked about that at the beginning, right? We talked about if you are looking at your internet and you are looking at access control, they're connected at the hip. The telecom and internet providers are more than happy to help you if you need that service. The access control folks, there's a clause. There's typically a clause in those access control contracts that says you will meet their standards that you provide it, whether or not their system will work. Should you provide, you meaning the association, the correct bandwidth for internet speeds or whatever it is I don't know whether it's hardwired or Wi-Fi, I don't know, but that's certainly it is a master plan. And with everything moving much towards virtual, because people want to save money on the labor of having 24-hour full-time gate guards, I understand the push, but make sure you've got what you need out there. And if you need to invest in infrastructure, you should look at that before you commit to that. That's a good point, Jonna.
Yeah, because unfortunately, the lesson learned is that the provider is not necessarily going to look into and tell you, oh, by the way, you don't have what you need to support this. Like you said, there's usually some type of clause in there saying, not our problem. It's
not theirs because you made that again. I forget who asked earlier about, is the management company supposed to know the contracts? Remember, the board signs them. And you have to know that that's a clause in there that you're promising, which is what I mentioned earlier about the association's promising confidentiality. The association is promising to cooperate and to give names. Well, one of the other promises you make is to the access company is that you're going to provide the correct amount of bandwidth so that their system operates. So, their equipment requires a bandwidth like this, and you're only providing it like that, there's going to be a bottleneck.
Mm-hmm.
So there's one other thing I wanted to mention. Oh, with regard to the landscape contracts, and this has been more in the past 2 or 3 years, I've seen this. I have a couple of clients that have had environmental and sustainability considerations in their landscape contracts. What are they doing with the clippings? What types of fuels are they using? What are they doing to reduce greenhouse gases in their operations? This is for much, much larger, for those of you on the call, if you're in a bigger association where there's multiple trucks and equipment on site, that is, and it's a little bit of a minor issue, but I have seen that issue come up in terms of compliance with local ordinances and best practices to, for sustainability concerns. Just a little, another small thing there. And, to the gentleman who asked about his park, about the, but most of them being snowbirds, there are some pricing structures, you can work on with respect to all of your contracts. Are they lump sum? Are they cost plus? Different types of pricing models that work for your association. Realize I'm jumping around quite a bit, but there's just so many different. And again, I think it's important. I mentioned this earlier about auditing the work of it, whether it's painting or landscape or access. You want to have certain performance metrics, and who's doing that. They can be baked in. They'll be, a lot of times you can put them in there. What are the metrics? But who's doing that? It costs money to do all that observation. So,
especially with those big contracts for work, like you were talking about roofing, and some of the, a lot of our condominiums right now are dealing with a lot of structural things of that nature. And we always tell our clients, like, the normal day-to-day stuff that a manager can put eyes on, like landscaping, things like that, absolutely, it's their job to look at those things, make sure they're getting done per the contract. But there's certain jobs that you need to hire a third party, either engineer or project manager, to check that scope of work and that it's done properly, because a property manager or property management company is not going to have the knowledge needed to know if some of that stuff is being done properly.
So that brings up a good point. With painting, large painting contracts, paving, roofing, you definitely want to have that project manager. You want to start thinking about that. Like if you're thinking about doing that in the next 24 months, start now. Mm-hmm. Our industry, whether it's management, whether it's engineering, architects, legal, accounting, everyone in the community association industry is taxed. The couple of 100,000 people that have moved here in the last 24 months and the amount of closings that occur in real estate has really pushed our industry to the limits. Engineers are booked out, and they may not take a lot of engineers won't take a project oversight project that they may have in the past because they're so busy. So expect to pay more, expect to manage that. And somebody asked a great question earlier about should the lawyer look at these contracts. I'm not looking for more work. I am extremely busy. And I say that as to my brothers and sisters who practice law in this area. We're all very busy. I'm active in our area, the bar. But please don't hesitate to lean on your lawyer and your management company for your larger contracts. Don't be penny wise and pound foolish. Because if you don't have information and requirements about insurance, what are the minimums, checking with your insurance broker, release of liens, payment terms, hold back. Those are all the things that you won't realize until much later. And then we could do a whole nother presentation on owners who have former careers in the engineering or in something that try to insert themselves into the process on social media. So we'll talk about that at another forum in terms of how to use and not use social media.
I think everybody, I don't care who you are, can use that these days. But yeah, no, the contracts, I mean, even us, like, listen, would we love when we engage with a new community to hand a contract over and have them say, oh yeah, this is great, perfect, let's sign off on it? Of course we would, but we encourage every potential client that we engage who says, hey, Castle, we think we want to move forward with you. First thing we say is, here's a draft contract. It's in Word format with track changes on. Send it. You guys review it as a board. Send it to your attorney. Like, do we have to do back and forth with the attorney? Of course, but that's expected and that's what should be done. That's your due diligence, is making sure that like we can't practice law. Like it's a you know, against the law for a management company. You know, you need to have attorneys you know, dot those I's and cross those T's, and we want them to do it on our own contracts, you know, that we're engaging with communities. So it's really, really important.
So in sum, know your worth, know the scope of what you're asking for, be reasonable. It's not a drive to the bottom, and understand what you're getting and when you're getting it. So that's and look for overlap. I mean, when was the last time I ask my clients this often? I ask them, I say, well, when was the last time someone did a top to bottom review of all the services you're getting for every contract obligation for the association? And normally I get looks like they're doing long division in their head. So it's just not something you think about, right? In the day-to-day grind of, and you know, at the same time, I'll double everybody's volunteer salary from 0 to 0.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the easiest way to do it is to keep a log. You know, it's part of our best practice to have every association have a contract renewal schedule, which is just a chart, you know, all the contracts listed, what are the terms, what's the termination clause, what's the escalation clause, you know, all those things. And it comes in very handy during budget season.
And with respect to the roofing contracts, I love my job. I love this area of the law. I could talk about it all day, but with those of you on the call who have roofing projects coming up, you want to get on top of that sooner rather than later. And you also want to make sure that you've contacted your insurance company, because what we are seeing, and Laura, I'm sure, and Shauna, you're seeing this. While you may have a 25-year roof that is an opinion of your engineer, the question is, what do you do at year 16? Because at year 16, most insurance companies are going to require you to replace that roof, or you're going to have a much, much higher chance of increased rates or non-renewal. So there are multiple authorities on who's controlling what you need to repair or when. And the insurance companies are really drilling down on making sure that the building envelope, including the roof and the siding and the windows, are up to snuff, because they don't want to be on the hook for that post, you know, Ian and last season. So expect to see those rate increases, but you definitely want to get on top of that roofing sooner rather than later.
Well, I haven't had any more questions come in. I think this has been great. It's been super informative. So thank you, Keith, as always. We appreciate you. We appreciate your time and your expertise. And we look forward to doing it again soon.
Thank you, thank you, Keith. Thank you, everybody else, for attending. Oh, will this be? Yes.
Yes, we will send out, Laura and I will send out emails to everybody who registered by end of week, and we will include a link to this recording. And we'll also include that document that Keith was talking about earlier in the presentation, and we can even include this outline in that. So we will do that. We'll include Keith's contact information as well. So if you want to chat with him further, you can reach out to him directly. If you need anything, Laura and I are available as well from a management aspect. But we thank everybody for joining us today. We hope everybody has an amazing holiday season, New Year, all the things. And we appreciate everybody who joined us today.
Thank you, guys.
Shauna. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.